So thanks everyone for coming along this afternoon. We're going to have a talk now on some of the historical glass that was found both at the Hume Exhibition, and there's going to be a bit of a background information on glass in general and what it can tell us. So Robin Murdoch is going to be speaking to us for that. We will have the opportunity to have some questions at the end, but Robin's a bit hard of hearing, so rather than do a sort of open question, if he's more than happy for people to come up and ask him individually afterwards, if that's okay. All right, so I'll hand over to Robin. Yeah. And we'll see what we can find there. Okay.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Do excuse the voice. I think I've got a cold coming on. I took a lateral flow test on Thursday night, and it was clear. And I've been triple jabbed, and I've got a flu jab as well, but, so I don't know what I've got. Anyway, let's start off. The nature of glass. Glass is a very strange material. One would imagine it's a solid. It's not. It's a super cold liquid. And it's actually flowing. Even the glass in the windows will be flowing. It would take thousands of years to reach the bottom of the pane. But nevertheless, that accounts for the clarity that we get in glass, because it's not a crystalline structure. There are no boundaries within glass that can stop being able to see through it, or light to actually ingress. There's three basic components. There's silica, which comes from most kinds of stone. You've also got a flux. Now, the reason that you have a flux in glass is that you could actually melt stone. As you can see in La Palma at the moment, you can seriously melt stone. But you need a temperature of at least 1700 degrees centigrade. Now, to try and create that in a furnace, going back in historic times, would be very, very difficult. So what they do is they add the flux, either a potassium or a sodium base. That reduces the temperature at which the silica will vitrify down to about 1200. And it keeps it malleable down to about 800. The problem with that is, if you've only got the silica and the stabilizer, it's soluble in water. You wouldn't believe that. Glass actually being soluble. All glass is more or less soluble in water. So they add a stabilizer in the form of lime calcium, and that stops that ability for water to do, or nearly stops it. I'll come back to that later. The glass can be coloured by adding other chemicals and changing furnace conditions. No evidence as yet that glass was made from raw materials in Scotland before about 1610. So we must assume then that before that everything was imported. Very little, my experience as an archaeologist, very little actually came from the south. Most came from the continent that was imported, and I think this is because of the animosity that traditionally existed between Scotland and England. One of the things that happened to glass is it corrodes. Even though it's been stabilised, historic glass will corrode in the presence of water, and here are three examples. The top one is probably a sodium, because these particular shards have never been analysed. This is before, I actually got these before I was involved in analysis of glass. But the soda glass at the top there, a potassium glass, there's characteristic dark brown corrosion in the middle. And the bottom one is the most peculiar glass I've ever come across. It was flexible. When we dug it up, you could actually, it was like marzipan. Very peculiar. I've never seen it before or since, but it just shows the level that corrosion can actually reach. This is actually a remarkable survival. One of the Edinburgh City Councillors was wandering down Lee Street in 1950, and there was two boxes of glass slides sitting ready for the refuse to come and pick them up. 400 of them, all of Edinburgh, in the late 1850s and 1860s. So that could have been lost forever. There's a book, Thomas Begbie's Edinburgh. If anybody's interested, I can give you the ISBN, etc. after the talk. But this was the, you see the two creative coins there. The one on the left, the slightly more rounded one, was the first one built in 1747. The other one is the last one, was built in about 1790. The works carried on till about 1875 before the site was abandoned. Right. One of the things that you will find on a Scottish archaeological site, you may not be surprised to know, is former alcoholic bottles. I think you might still find a few today. But the small fragments of wine or possibly beer bottles, the two were very, very similar up until the early 19th century. Most of the fragments that came out of the excavations in Hume were small fragments of bottles, wine or ale. Not necessarily related to occupation, but perhaps related to their activities in the 18th century when they were making Hume Castle into a folly. I mean, these guys wouldn't be out on site with the best china, but they could easily have had bottles with them when they were actually working. And you can see that the evolution of the bottle from the very rounded one at the top here. They came into England initially, the glass wine bottle from Belgium around about 1630, and had reached Scotland probably by about 30 years later. That shows you the development of shape. Now, if you can find a significant part of a bottle with any of these shape attributes on them, you can then roughly identify it. That is a neck from a wine bottle that's found at Crammon Tower. It's actually in the right-hand glass case over there at the moment, just for you to be able to see. But that is the earliest neck that I have seen so far from a Scottish site. And that includes what's in the museum in Chambers Street in Edinburgh. That's what that neck probably came from. A couple of bottles like that. One of the interesting things is you see the seal on the shoulder of the bottle. The wine bottles were very expensive when they were first made, and a lot of them ended up with seals on them denoting the owner, and it could be anything from a heraldic device to a name, whatever. But the important thing was that a lot of them were dated. So that is what has allowed the evolution to actually be sussed out. Moving on a wee bit later, in the 18th century, a much squatter world, again still with the seals. 1730s, 1740s. Now the early wine bottles were not rack storage. They were normally used for decanting at table. So they would be filled in the cellar and taken to the table. This one is a sort of transitory stage heading towards a more cylindrical bottle that could be rack stored. And it's a mallet bottle, and what we call a mallet bottle. Moving on a wee bit further, 1750s, again from the same site, Smithfield Basket. I don't know if you know what a basket house is. It's basically a miniature keep. It's a vaulted ground floor with living accommodation above it. So in times of strife, you did have a little bit of protection. They come very late on, late 16th into the 17th century. But you notice that they're now reaching a cylindrical shape. Moving along a wee bit further, the bottle gradually reduces in diameter, increases in height, heading towards the shape that we're familiar with today. I've actually brought a partial bottle with me that dates to about 1780, and it's in the glass case at the moment as well. You have a wee look at. There are other bottles that we find frequently on site. The case bottles, so called that they were packed in cases for transportation. The one on the left, the straight-sided one, is the earliest one. They then tapered them in order to be able to pack straw in between them for extra security for transportation. The largest bottle there contained 11 litres, 2.5 gallons, and it contained probably gin. No wonder it was called Mother's Ruin. 11 litres is actually quite a lot of gin. Moving on to containers, there were any number of shapes of drinking vessels. This is a classic from round about 1700. One of the interesting things about it is the foot. It's what they call a folded foot, where the foot was actually folded over underneath to double the thickness to reduce chipping. Also, you'll notice there's a teardrop in the stem. Now that's actually quite important, because I think what happened next was a derivation from that. Now you'll all be familiar probably with these twisted stems. They're coming back into vogue now. You can actually get modern versions. But the traditional twisted stem started off with an air twist, And then they introduced what they called a cotton twist. This was thread-like white glass. And the last stage was coloured twists. But the twisted stem came in about 1730 and disappears about 1780. It only lasted 50 years. I mean, they're pretty to look at, but 1780, gone. Now moving on, I'm just going to put these down, just a use. Move on to window glass. Now this is something I'm particularly interested in. As I say, for the last 10 years, I've been studying the composition of window glass, because we can now tell from its composition reasonably closely when the glass was made. And this can be very, very useful. Two traditional methods of making window glass. The first one, broad glass. That dates back originally to the 1st century AD. What they did was they blew a tube of glass, cut the ends off, split the sides, and allowed the glass to fall onto an iron sheet. Now, one of the problems was that the iron sheets typically weren't very clean. So what happened was, one side of your glass was nice and shiny, the other side was poor quality optically. So it would let light in, but you wouldn't see very much outside. So window glass originally was more for admitting light and keeping the weather out than it was for viewing your garden or anything like that. And that was the typical production method up to about 1700. Crown glass took over there. They started off in exactly the same way of blowing a bubble of glass. And what they did was they took a solid rod and stuck it onto the end away from the blowpipe, sheared the blowpipe off, opened out that aperture, reheated, and then spun the glass until it flashed out into a disc, anything up to 5 feet in diameter. The beauty of that was that because they kept spinning it until it had stiffened enough to support its own weight. The beauty of that is the glass was shiny on both sides, so the optical quality was far superior to the broad glass, and it was quickly adopted, and it was particularly important after 1745, when taxation was introduced, because the glass was taxed on its weight. And you can actually make crown glass much thinner than broad glass. At the same time, they introduced tax on windows. And I think over time it varied between, you could have up to 5 or as many as 8 at one stage windows before you were due tax. So the bigger houses with lots of windows were due tax. And that explains a lot of buildings that you see of that period which are blocked in windows. A lot of that was related to evading the taxation on these windows. In actual fact, painting over the glass so you couldn't see through it would actually have done this just as well. But a lot of people chose to actually put stone in. Now, the great problem with crown glass was, as you see, that the top disc is 48 inches in old money. I'm going to talk inches here rather than meters. I come from that era. I'm conversing in both in actual fact. Since they were made in imperial, I'm going to talk in imperial. The top one's a 48-inch disc, the other one's a 49-inch disc. Now, it just shows you how good these guys must have been to actually be able to control the diameter of the disc in the operation of spinning. But you can see the limitations on the number of panes that you could get from each disc. They were typically called tables. But if you were looking, for instance, for that size of pane, you could only get 2 per disc. It meant that they had to be very, very careful in how they marketed the panes of glass in order to be successful and efficient in the amount of glass that they used. Before, I'm trying to remember the dates here. Before about 1670 in Scotland, if a building had window glass, then it would be that format. You see the small upper fixed leaded pane with little diamond-shaped corners or panes in lead surrounds. These, in fact, these windows in this room, they're leaded windows. Below that would either be 1 or 2 opening shutters. That situation lasted through until about the 1670s. I have to get a pub into the equation somehow. This is the Three Sisters in the County of Edinburgh, and although it's a refurbishment, it shows you what the first case windows, which is basically what I think most of us will have seen or still have in their houses. In fact, if you look across the street, they have these are case windows. Small panes, very thick astragals, holding it. Astragals were the dividing wooden struts. I think they didn't trust the actual strength of thin astragals. Having said that, there's a big difference between Scotland and England here. In England, the glazing was part of the overall contract. In Scotland, the structure and the glazing were 2 different things. What happened in Scotland is a rebate or recess was created by the builder on the inside, and the window was inserted later. So it wasn't in fact structural. This is Traquair House. Now the earliest sash windows, the upper sash was fixed and the lower sash was lifted physically and locked in position with these quadrant stops. It meant you could open the window in two places. But the other image there is also from Traquair House, and you can see how expensive glass was because the lobby's been using broken glass for that window there, and that was a fairly sophisticated house. very, very easy way to recognise ground glass. It has curvature. When they spun the actual disc, the final shape is actually slightly mushroom shaped. So you get curvature in the panes. I think you can see this is the New Parliament House in Edinburgh, just along from St Giles. You can see on the first floor the obvious curvature of the panes. That dates about 1810, 1820, something like that. It was getting near the end of the Crown period. Now, Hume Castle. I have devised a method of selection when I get a glass assemblage to actually study and report on. What I do is I scan all of the glass and then put it through something like Adobe Photoshop. Increase the saturation of the colours, because most glass has little colour or very similar colour. But by increasing the saturation, you can actually differentiate, and the glass there is exaggerated from its actual colour, but it's allowed me to select groups of glass that are similar. I then take one example and get that analysed either by portable XRF or SEM with a what's called processor with it. Now, from these results, the printed numbers there, by the way, are small fine numbers. When you find something on site, you generally package it, give it a small find number, which has the context that it came from. So it's a method of cataloguing, so as you know where something has actually come from. Now, from the results of the analysis on the Hume Castle glass, can you see that the context numbers in the first column, the ones starting with the numeral 1, are all from trench 1. The ones starting with numeral 2 are from trench 2. But do you notice that trench 1 only has the glass types E, C, D, and E in it, and they're all probably pre-1700. They're certainly of a type of glass of mid to late 17th century type. It's still slightly unusual. I've got positive dates for it yet, but it won't be a million miles away from that. On the contrary, trench 2 has window glass of a whole range of dates, up to fairly modern. This is doing analysis using PXRF, portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer. I'm only going to say that once. PXRF. This was a colleague of mine, Murdoch, from Historic Scotland. And you'll notice she's got a kit on her back. Now, one of the problems with the PXRF is it's not very good with weak signals. And light elements produce very light X-ray returns. They can be absorbed in the air. So what she's got on her back there is a canister of helium, and the detector on the PX array is flushed with helium, and that improves its accuracy looking at lower levels of edge rays. Now, just to show you, the window glass that came from Hume, Trench 1, the early stuff, has exactly the same composition as these two panes. I think you can see all the deficiencies and gas bubbles and goodness knows all. That's in the priest's room in Trippier House. It's on the top floor that we know was built in 1640. But these astragals, you see how broad and heavy they are, they're not 1640. They're quite a bit later in the 17th century, if not even slightly after 1700. It's been a rework, and I think what it's telling us that these panes have been possibly reused. Now, a colleague and I analysed every available pane of glass in New Hale's house in Musselburgh. There's 550 in total, and that took quite a while. But it's interesting, because what we can do with the PX array, as you saw at Trippier, we can use that in standing building. We didn't do the first floor with the red lines there, because we know that the first floor, which was the main occupation floor for the family, we know that these windows were replaced in 1870. So there's no point checking these. The thing is that the wing here, these are all false windows. They're actually stone, they've been painted to just maintain the symmetry of the actual building itself. The central portion of the house, from these quarries or cornerstones to that set there, that seven bays, date to about 1685. The two wings were added in the early 18th century, and the right-hand side there with the blind windows, in actual fact, is a library which extends from above the ground floor right to the roof. So there's no dividing floor in that particular. Now, from that, I was able to do a schematic diagram. We had 12 different types of glass. And what I've done is on the schematic, given a colour reference for each type. So from this, I think a forensic analysis could work out the ability of the local vandal, how high you could throw a stone. Because you'll probably notice that the green panes, there's more of them on the top floor than there is on the ground floor. So obviously they couldn't get the stones high enough to break the top of it. But it just shows you how much information you could get from a standing structure by doing that. Not throwing stones, but testing the windows. And finally, there's this rather splendid window, which is in the Magdalen Chapel in the county of Edinburgh. Now, unfortunately, the diligence of the Reformation in Scotland was that the great majority of windows dated to before the Reformation were actually destroyed. This survived, possibly because John Knox used it as his headquarters for a while, so he stopped short of knocking his own windows in. But what you've got here is you've got the arms of Scotland, the arms of Mary of Guise, Mary Queen of Scots' mother, Michael McQueen and Janet Wynd. Now Michael McQueen died before the chapel was built, but his wife, Janet Wynd, got the chapel built and this window was installed. But the interesting thing is here that I arranged to go along there with the PXRF and check that glass. I thought this is a one and only opportunity. I arrived to discover that a sheet of modern glass had been put over the whole thing. So I couldn't get at the actual glass that I was interested in. But I think looking at it, you can see that there are quite a number of changes, replacements, especially there. These are probably original. These and these are not. Say this side, that and that is probably original, the rest are not. And you can also notice colour differences in the greens in some of the elements of Scotland. So, but I have asked the Magdalen Chapel if they ever get refurbishment done there, that please give me a shout and we'll go and fix it. And that's it, thank you. If anybody would like to ask me any questions, as Ian said, my hearing is absolutely atrocious, but please do come across in the corner near the glass case there, and if you have a question, please do. Okay,
Thank you very much, Robert. That was fascinating. Really interesting what we could find out from that. So, and thanks again to everyone for coming along for that. That's the last talk we're doing today, but the exhibition will open until 4, so please feel free to, as Robert says, ask him any questions, and myself and Michelle are here as well, so you can ask us any questions about the excavations that have been going on at the Hume as well. So, thank you.